The Africa 2017 Forum is wrapping up later today in the Egyptian resort city of Sharm el Sheikh. President Abdel Fattah EL Sisi has been hosting 6 African heads of state and top business leaders from the continent. The leaders include current African Union chairperson and Guinea's President Alpha Conde. The presidents of Chad, Rwanda, Cote d'Ivoire and Somalia have also attended. The theme of this year's Business and Investment Forum was driving investment for inclusive growth. One of the main topics of discussion has been increasing intra-African investment and cross-border collaboration. Well, let's get you more on that story now. I'm joined live from Sharm el Sheikh by CGTN's Uche Okoronkwo. Uche, can you just tell us more about the highlights of the forum?
Well, Lindy, it's been quite an interesting 3 days here. Of course, 2017 has been quite a transitional year for a number of Africa's governments. We're seeing Egypt, IMF reforms kicking in, Nigeria coming out of recession, South Africa regaining its political and economic footing. We're also seeing commodity prices such as oil rebounding. So there's certainly an acknowledgement that there's an improved outlook in terms of capital market investments and strategic investments on the continent. We also had McKinsey come out and giving us a picture about Africa's consumer market changing as we move forward. In fact, they said consumer spending expected to grow by about 38% by 2025 per year. They also mentioned the fact that business spending on the continent will continue to grow from about 2.6 trillion US dollars in 2015 to 3.5 trillion dollars by 2025. Now, of course, we know today was China Day. They talked about the role of special economic zones in terms of Africa's industrialization. And joining me to discuss about this issue, more about this issue, is Helen Hai. Of course, she is a Goodwill Ambassador with UNIDO, as well as the CEO of the Made in Africa initiative. Thank you so much for joining us. So let's start with the discussion around China today, special economic zones, the role China is going to play. Give us some insight into what was the outcome of that discussion.
Great. I think first of all, it's important for Africa to understand today you have a choice. Maybe in the past you don't have a choice, but today you have a choice. You can learn from Europe, you can learn from US, you can also learn from China. So this is the number one I think it's very important to remember. Secondly, if you ask me, does China has a big grand strategy towards Africa? The answer is no. I would say the China strategy is a win-win partnership and has always been in phases. The first phase, in my opinion, started in the 70s when China was very poor, or similar like Africa, and China was able to get into United Nations with the support of African countries. That's why at that time, China internally we call Africa are our poor brothers. So China went into Africa in Tanzania to build the railway. At that stage, being the China being a poor country, that partnership is very much aid-based. And then they started to evolve in the 80s because China started its own economic transformation. Then China needed a lot of natural resources. That's why you're seeing a lot of Chinese companies going to Africa purchasing natural resources. So that's moved from aid to natural resource base. And then it evolved in the 90s again. Why? Because China developed a very strong comparative advantage in civil engineering, building the infrastructures. And Africa need actually to build its own infrastructures. That's why we're seeing a lot of Chinese companies coming to Africa to support infrastructures. So that would be the infrastructure-based driven, the third phase. This started to evolve again in December 2015. President Xi in Johannesburg in the China-Africa Forum, he announced China going to support coming 3 years 60 billion to Africa. And then he talked about 10 projects. The top 4, in my opinion, are very important. Number 1, industrialization for Africa. Number 2, modern agriculture development for Africa. Number 3, financing for Africa. Number 4, infrastructure. As you can see right now, China is supporting the economic transformation for Africa. The path is very clear, the same path China taken, which is industrialization and modern agriculture development. And financing and infrastructure is going to becoming enablers of this strategy. So now if you ask me to say at current stage, China is very interested to support the economic transformation in Africa. Because why? If we can support the currently Africa moving from lower income status to middle income status, that means that's a much bigger news globally, to driving the global growth, for economic. And at the same time, it's also rebalancing the trade deficit because China invested heavily in infrastructure in Africa. Without the economic transformation, Africa can never repay those loans back. So it's very important for all of us to support in Africa in its own economic transformation.
Now, quite interestingly, you're also an advisor to a lot of African governments in terms of industrialization. So give us some insight into the progress you've seen so far in terms of Africa's industrialization, China's role, and certainly the challenges that are being faced.
Great. So first we need to look at, would the industrialization really help in Africa? So in our human history from 1950 to 2008, there's about 200 developing economies globally. In those years, only 2 economies actually moved from lower income status to higher income status. That is South Korea and Taiwan. China likely to be the third one. And out of those 200 developing economies, only 13 of them moved from middle income status to higher income status. Out of those 13 economies, 8 of them are in Europe. The original GDP gap is small. The other 5 are the Asia 4 tigers, plus Japan. So it's a common consensus in the 60s. Africa has a much better chance for economic transformation due to the natural resources. Asia is a hopeless continent. But the reality is very different. Why? Because those countries in Asia, they took a very pragmatic approach. They didn't follow in the Washington consensus. They believed job creation, it is a key for poverty reduction. And how to create so much jobs? The thing is, those countries were able to capture the golden opportunity during 60s and 80s, during the industrialization relocation, which they were able to create millions of jobs for the people in the bottom of the pyramid. And that is the jump start of those countries' economic transformation. Today, if I'm talking about Africa, would Africa have the same chance? The answer is yes. Why? The GDP per capita in China in the year I was born, 1978, is only $154, which is less than 1/3 of the sub-Saharan Africa countries. China was very poor at that time. But in my generation, I witnessed 680 million people has been lifted out the international poverty line. Right now, China is not only celebrating that, while also contributing 30% of the global growth on GDP. So why the reason China can do it? Because the huge economic transformation, job creation, and the GDP per capita in China in 2015 is 7,600, and according to China's own forecast, by 2025 we're going to double that. That means that's a golden opportunity. Why? By 2025, all those labor-intensive jobs have to be relocated out of China. Exactly what happened in the 60s and 80s. But this round of relocation is far more complicated. Why? In the 60s, when Japan was relocating, they only relocate 9.7 million jobs. In the 80s, when Korea was relocating to China, they only relocate 2.3 million jobs. This round, how many jobs are relocating out of China? 85 million jobs. That's huge. Where would those jobs to go? So some African country leaders, if they can grasp a significant proportion of those jobs, that means the jump start of those countries' economic transformation.
And sorry to interrupt you, but I'd like to ask, what are the success stories that you have seen on the continent so far in terms of those countries stepping up and taking advantage of these jobs being moved?
I think the key successful example is Ethiopia, which Africa should be really proud. Back in 2011, Ethiopia ranked 125 according to World Bank doing business report. In theory, investors would never come to that country, picked Ethiopia. But one leader, they made a decision. In 2011, when the late Prime Minister Meles met the chief economist of the World Bank, Professor Lin, and then he understood those 85 million jobs are relocating out of China. He made a decision he want to make a quick, successful example to bring the inspiration, leadership, confidence, and experience to the country and to the continent. He personally went to China, invited a group of investors, including a shoe factory. And as we know, the shoe factory Huajian set up in Ethiopia, creating 4,000 jobs, demonstrate, in that kind of circumstances in Ethiopia back in 2011, it is ready to get into global value chain. Today, we are seeing that 10 industrial parks in Ethiopia. Ethiopia went on this journey on industrialization. The latest industrial park in Ethiopia called Havasa Park is going to generate 60,000 local jobs, 100% to export to the US market, and 1 billion export revenue. I think that is a miracle. You know, Ethiopia has been demonstrating, which is a model the rest of the country can follow. But why I say this model is actually the leadership. The investor did not pick Ethiopia, that's to start with. And I give you another example of Ethiopia. I remember when I first came to the Ethiopia, you know, we went into some rural area, seeing some children that are suffering from hunger. The investor didn't make the decision to invest. We wrote a check of 100,000 US dollars. We gave it to the minister. When the minister looked at the check back in 2011, do you know what the minister said? The minister looked at it for 30 seconds. And he returned it back to the investor. He said, I don't want fish from you. I want you to teach us how to catch the fish. It is that kind of spirit, I think, helped them, you know, starting on this journey for industrialization. Those ministers and also the officers I've been dealing with in the government, they didn't go to Harvard. They didn't go to MIT, but they have a very something important in their heart. They want to make their people's life better. They care about the people in the bottom of the pyramid, and they're trying every effort to make that happen.
So what I'm getting from you is leadership is quite key in terms of Africa's industrial revolution.
Very important.
Very important. Well, unfortunately, we do have to leave it there, but quite an interesting discussion. Thank you so much for joining us. Of course, that was Helen Hai. She's the CEO of Made in Africa Initiative, as well as a UNIDO Goodwill Ambassador. It's back to you in the studio, Lindy.
Some fascinating insights there. Thank you so much, Uche Okoronkwo, live in Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt.